$8.8 billion. That is the size of one money laundering machine, hidden in plain sight inside the global banking system. It was built by Troika Dialog, once Russia's largest private investment bank. The kind of firm that prints glossy annual reports and sponsors black tie galas. But here's the part most people miss. The dirty money did not stay hidden in Russia. It walked out through banks in Vienna, Frankfurt, and the Baltics, banks you would trust. And if you work in compliance, correspondent banking, or financial crime, the controls this network defeated are the same controls sitting on your desk right now. This was not a back alley operation. It was a clean, corporate, industrial-scale system for moving billions out of Russia and into the wider world. At least 75 offshore shell companies, around 1.3 million banking transactions, more than 238,000 companies and people swept up in the data. It ran from 2006 to early 2013. 7 years of non-stop laundering, hiding in the noise of ordinary international payments. The beating heart of the machine sat in Lithuania at a regional lender called Ukio Bankas, a bank most of the world had never heard of. The beneficiaries were not street criminals. They were oligarchs, well-connected insiders, and people orbiting the very top of Russian power. What makes this case essential is simple. The money did not break into the financial system. It was politely shown through the front door. So let me ask you, right at the start, if you work in transaction monitoring, would your system have caught this? Tell me in the comments, because by the end of this, you might not be so sure. Here is the first uncomfortable truth. This machine was not stopped by a regulator. It was not caught by a bank's compliance team. It was exposed by journalists. It started with a leak. A trove of banking records so large, it represented one of the biggest releases of financial data ever seen. Reporters from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and a Lithuanian newsroom shared the data with more than 20 partners across Europe. And that single fact tells you everything about why this case still matters. The people inside the banks could not see what the journalists could. Stay with me, and I will show you exactly why. Over the next several minutes, I will trace this machine from the inside out, how money entered, how it was scrubbed, where it landed, and the exact red flags every institution should burn into memory. But before the mechanics, hold on to one number. Of that $8.8 billion, roughly $4.6 billion flowed in, and $4.8 billion flowed back out, cleaner than it came. Every laundromat, no matter how complex it looks, runs on 3 simple stages. Get the money in, move it around until nobody can trace it, then spend it like it was always clean. Stage 1 is entry. A client in Russia wanted to move money offshore without anyone asking hard questions, so Troika gave them a story to tell the bank. That story was almost always a fake contract. A Russian company would sign a deal with one of the shells for consulting, market research, or vague services, often at wildly inflated prices. On paper, it looked like a payment for real work. In reality, the service never existed. The contract was just permission for the money to move. And why go to all this trouble? Because moving large sums out of Russia openly invited tax questions, currency controls, and the attention of rivals. The machine let wealth slip out quietly, dressed as ordinary business. Stage 2 is layering. This is the part that makes investigators lose sleep. Once the money was inside, it began to move in circles between the shells, faster than any human could follow. A shell would pay another shell. That shell would loan it back. A third would invoice both. Each move added a layer of paperwork between the dirty source and the final destination. And there were dozens of these shells, registered in secrecy havens like the British Virgin Islands and Panama, on paper. Total strangers in reality, all pulling from the same hand. How do we know one hand controlled them all? Because investigators found shared administrators, shared addresses, and invoices sent from the very same email domain, troika.ru. Stage 3 is exit. After enough layering, the money looked clean. Now it could leave the machine and buy real things in the real world. And what did it buy? Real estate in Britain, Spain, and Montenegro. Luxury yachts, fine artwork, school tuition at elite Western academies, even music superstars hired for private parties. But to spend that money in the West, the shells needed real Western banks. And this is where the machine got clever. It borrowed the reputation of major correspondent banks. This is called a nested relationship. The big bank served the small bank, and the small bank served the shells. The big bank often could not see who was really on the other end. Now make this personal. If your bank provides correspondent services, you may be 3 steps removed from a customer you have never met in a structure you cannot fully see. And these were not obscure institutions. Reporting tied Troika flows to names like Raiffeisen in Austria, Commerzbank in Germany, and Nordea in the Nordics. Household names in European banking. So how did so many serious banks miss billions in suspicious flows? Not through one big failure, through dozens of small, ordinary ones that lined up perfectly. Weakness 1. The paperwork looked fine. Troika supplied contracts, invoices, and shipping documents on demand, all neat enough to satisfy a quick compliance review. Weakness 2. Language and distance. Contracts arrived in languages head office could not read. From a small foreign bank, nobody at the top was watching closely. Weakness 3. Under-resourced teams, a handful of analysts facing an ocean of transactions, will always rely on rules, and rules only catch what they were told to look for. That is the quiet danger. A rules-based system can tell you a payment is unusual. It almost never tells you that 50 boring payments together form a circle. Each transaction was a single dot, innocent on its own. The crime only became visible when you connected the dots into a shape, and no single bank could see the whole shape. To keep the whole structure deniable, the people behind it needed one more thing. They needed names on the paperwork that could never be traced back to them, so they borrowed other people's lives. Let me tell you about Armen Ustian, a seasonal construction worker who, on paper, controlled a Panama company moving tens of millions of dollars. When journalists found him, he could barely afford to heat his home. His signature appeared on more than $70 million in agreements. He was listed as the owner of an offshore company called Dino Capital. He had no idea what was being done in his name. This is the human cost that gets lost in the numbers. Real people, often poor and powerless, turned into legal masks for crimes they never understood, never benefited from, and could not refuse. Then there is Eric Rabasso, an Austrian lawyer, through whose accounts roughly $96 million flowed. He sent money from a Western bank to offshore shells, dressing it up with fabricated paperwork. And when a transfer needed cover, the paperwork was simply manufactured to fit. Fabricated contracts and invoices were generated on demand, each one designed to answer the exact question a compliance officer might ask. Notice the pattern. A lawyer here, a quiet bank there, a tidy contract everywhere. Respectability itself was the disguise. The more ordinary it looked, the better it worked. In one case described by investigators, around 13 million euros moved through 2 offshore companies to buy villas on Spain's Costa Brava in the name of an 80-year-old proxy who never set foot there. Think about that property bought from 1,000 miles away, in the name of a pensioner paid for by companies he did not run. Every layer added a little more distance between the asset and the truth. So who actually benefited at the top? Investigators connected the network to members of Russia's business and political elite, including figures linked to people in President Putin's inner circle. Some names had already surfaced in other scandals, including a musician closely tied to the Kremlin and structures connected to the Magnitsky affair, one of the most notorious fraud cases in modern Russia. And the spending told its own story. Beyond property and yachts, the money reportedly paid for fine artwork, event tickets, tuition at prestigious schools, medical bills, and lavish private entertainment. A whole charmed life financed from the shadows. And it was never only about cleaning money. The same machine let insiders quietly buy shares in state-owned companies, hide investments, and dodge taxes, all behind the same wall of shells. That flexibility was the genius of it. But it was also the flaw, because every one of those uses left a fingerprint in the data. And fingerprints, once you have the whole picture, can be read. Now back to the mechanics, because here's where it gets useful for you. The most common cover story in the machine was fake trade, buying and selling goods that often did not exist. And the invoices barely tried to hide it. The descriptions were almost comically vague. Goods, food goods, metal goods, auto parts. No models, no quantities, no shipping records to back any of it. Here's a test any analyst can apply. If goods are really crossing borders, there is a trail, a shipper, a route, a customs entry, a warehouse. In the machine, that trail simply did not exist. Other times the goods were real, but the price was a lie. Over-invoicing and under-invoicing let them move value across borders simply by writing the wrong number on a genuine-looking document. And the prices were rarely accidental. A consulting fee of a few $1,000s would be written up as hundreds of thousands. The gap between the real value and the invoiced value was the whole point. That gap was the money escaping. Inside the machine, clean and dirty money were poured into the same accounts and stirred together. Once mixed, it became almost impossible to point at any single dollar and say with certainty where it came from. And the story behind each transfer kept changing. A payment that left as a consulting fee might arrive as a loan, then be repaid as a trade settlement. Same money, 3 different costumes, 3 layers of distance. Here is another tell investigators leaned on. Real commerce is messy. Invoices land on odd amounts with odd cents. The machine moved suspiciously clean, round figures, again and again, the signature of numbers invented rather than earned. And watch the clock. Money would arrive in an account and leave again within hours, sometimes the same day. Legitimate businesses let funds sit and work. A pass-through account treats money like a hot coal, held only long enough to move it on. Then came the loans. Shell A would loan money to Shell B. B would repay with interest. Round and round, until the money looked like the boring repayment history of legitimate businesses. Why did this fool people for 7 years? Because each individual step was, on its own, completely normal. Companies sign contracts. Companies trade. Companies lend. The crime lived in the pattern, not the parts. I want to bring you in here. Investigators and analysts watching this. What would be the first red flag you would chase in this structure? The vague goods, the proxies, the circular loans. Drop it in the comments. I read them. For 7 years, the machine ran almost flawlessly. Then, in 2013, the hub went dark. Lithuanian regulators shut down Ukio Bankas for unsafe practices, and the primary engine stalled. And Ukio was not the only Lithuanian door. A second now-defunct bank, Snoras, appears in the records too. When one channel drew attention, the operators simply had another ready. Redundancy is a feature of serious laundering, but the machine left something behind. Records. Millions of them, every fake contract, every circular payment, every proxy signature had been written down, and eventually that data leaked. What journalists received was staggering. Around 1.3 million transactions, drawn from a dataset worth over $470 billion in total flows, a near-complete map of the machine. Then came the real work. Analysts did not just read the records. They reverse-engineered the machine using techniques that, frankly, every serious bank should now have in its own toolkit. Technique 1. Network analysis. They mapped who paid whom across hundreds of entities, and the dense clusters of companies trading only with each other lit up like a fingerprint. Technique 2. Pattern analysis. Round number transfers. Repeated vague descriptions, payments that went out and came straight back. Behavior no honest business would ever repeat thousands of times. Technique 3. Corporate linkage. They matched shared addresses, shared directors, and those telltale troika.ru email domains, quietly proving that dozens of strangers were really one operation. Technique 4. Beneficial ownership analysis. When a seasonal worker or a pensioner supposedly owns a multi-million-dollar company, that mismatch is not a curiosity. It is a flashing alarm. Investigators did not work from the leak alone. They cross-referenced it against earlier exposures like the Panama Papers, against corporate registries, and against open-source records, until the same names lit up again and again. Now here's the part that should keep you up at night. The journalists had one advantage no single bank has. They could see across many banks at once. They saw the whole machine. Your bank only sees its own corner. I have pulled the full-source documents, the corporate links, and the timeline of this case together on davincidiligence.com and walked through the whole investigation on our Spotify podcast. Both links are in the description if you want to go deeper. Once the reporting landed, the consequences spread. In Germany, authorities raided properties and businesses tied to the network, with estimates that around $1 billion of the machine's money had passed through the country. Take one strand reporters pulled. The Nordic bank Nordea was said to have handled hundreds of millions in questionable flows and to have extended loans worth around 420 million euros to companies in the network. And Nordea was not alone. As reporting spread, more familiar names surfaced around the edges of the network, the same names that kept appearing in scandal after scandal across European banking that decade. In Spain, anti-corruption investigators began examining those Costa Brava villas, tracing whether laundromat money had quietly bought up stretches of the coastline through offshore names. And at the institutional level, Europe could no longer look away. The Council of Europe took up laundromats directly, pointing to weak Baltic banking, fragmented supervision, and the soft underbelly of correspondent banking. And investigators kept circling one regional truth. For years, parts of the Baltic banking system had become a preferred doorway for high-risk money from the former Soviet space, with oversight that simply had not kept pace with the flow. And banks were not the only enablers. Trust and corporate service providers spun up the shells. Lawyers lent their accounts. Each respectable profession that looked away became another quiet gear in the machine. The legislative answer followed. Stronger beneficial ownership registers, the sixth Anti-Money Laundering Directive, and plans for a single European anti-money laundering authority to end the patchwork of national blind spots. You might be asking, where is the single giant trial that ended it all? There isn't one. The machine was attacked in pieces, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. That fragmentation is itself one of the case's hardest lessons. So let me turn all of this into something you can actually use on Monday morning. Because the real value of Troika is not the scandal. It is the checklist it hands every financial institution that is paying attention. Lesson 1. Risk appetite is a control. Decide in advance how much offshore, non-resident, and high-risk business you will accept, and make sure no relationship manager's bonus can quietly override that line. Lesson 2. Know who really owns the customer. Troika thrived on proxies, robust beneficial ownership checks, and a hard look when a pensioner appears to run a fortune would have stopped it cold at onboarding. Lesson 3. Validate the business model. If a company claims to trade goods, ask the obvious questions. Where are the shipments? Who are the real counterparties? Does any of this match how the world actually works? Lesson 4. Stop monitoring transactions one at a time. Build network and behavioral analytics that compare each customer to its peers and surface the circular flows and back-to-back loans that single alerts will always miss. Lesson 5. If you're a correspondent bank, the respondent's customers are your risk too. Demand transparency on nested relationships and be willing to walk away from a small foreign bank you cannot truly see into. Lesson 6. Use the work others have already done. Build watch lists from public investigations like this one. Screen against them with fuzzy matching, and let adverse media warn you before the regulator does. And Lesson 7. The one no software can install for you culture. The staff who could have stopped this needed to feel safe questioning a profitable, powerful client. A challenge culture is the cheapest control you own. Lesson 8. Aimed straight at trade finance teams. Treat the goods description as evidence, not decoration. Demand the shipping route, the customs data, the freight provider. A trade that cannot prove it physically happened probably never did. Lesson 9. Make due diligence a living thing. A sudden surge in volume, a new offshore counterparty, a change in ownership. Each one should trigger a fresh review, because the customer you onboarded is not always the customer you have a year later. And weigh the real cost of staying quiet. Banks tied to laundromats have faced enormous fines, criminal scrutiny, and lasting damage to their names. The profitable client who feels too valuable to question is almost always the most expensive one you keep. And Lesson 10. Document your judgment. Every decision not to file a report, not to exit a client, should be written down with its reasoning and revisited the moment new information appears. A clear record is your defense and your memory, because every weakness Troika exploited had a control on paper. The contracts were reviewed. The accounts were opened by the book. The failure was not missing rules. It was treating compliance as a box to tick rather than a question to ask. Which brings us to the real lesson. The one most coverage of this case misses. Troika was not undone by a smarter rule or a faster computer. It was undone the moment someone could finally see across all the banks at once. So the question for your institution is not whether you have enough rules. It is whether you can see the shape of what is moving through you. Visibility, not paperwork, is what actually beats a laundromat. And remember, Troika was not the first laundromat, and it will not be the last. The Russian and Azerbaijani laundromats came before it. The structure is a template, and templates get reused and refined. And somewhere right now, a refined version of this exact structure is almost certainly running. Different banks, different shells, the same logic. The professionals who learn to read Troika are the ones who will recognize it the next time. So carry this out of the video: vague trade descriptions, proxies who cannot match their paperwork, circular flows, tiny banks feeding giant ones. None of these is rare. Once you have seen them here, you will see them again. If this investigation changed the way you look at an ordinary payment, do one thing for me. Subscribe. I break down a new financial crime case like this every single week, and I would like you in the room for the next one. Share this with someone in compliance, banking, or finance who needs to see how the front door really gets opened. And next week, I am tracing how a single sham invoice can move a fortune across 3 continents. Subscribe so you do not miss it.